Uh, I will say that I'm going to mute everyone real quickly. There we go. Um, you can unmute later. So the format, as ever, is that I'm going to start off with my presentation, and then if I say something that you want to ask a question about or is particularly offensive, that you can't wait to jump in, just hold on till the end, and then we'll open it up to general discussion. I have a feeling, based on some comments on Instagram, that we might have a heated discussion at the end. Maybe not. Maybe everyone's going to be on board one way or the other. But again, the topic for today is shooting film in the digital age, question mark, question mark, question mark, as in, should we be, why are we, what's going on with all of that, right? So this, I promise, is not going to be a bombastic presentation where I just like tout the greatness of one thing over the other and bash the other one down. I'm going to try to be fairly neutral in the presentation, although because I still photograph with film cameras myself, I'm sure there's going to be a built-in bias that's going to leak through some of the examples I give, although I did try to be a little more careful about it. I do think it's an interesting topic and one worth discussing in more detail. So I've given my full disclosure. I think often this comes up is there's this question of why. There's these why questions that we get bombarded with, not just as artists, but as people in general. And one of them is like, I remember when I was first starting out, there'd be like, why use alternative processes? Then why shoot large format? When I was in graduate school, all the time I got, why am I shooting black and white? Why am I not shooting color, right? That was like, I can't remember how many times I had to defend that in my studio with visiting artists coming through. It just got exhausting after a while. And now I think, especially I saw, because when I was working at Columbia and working with the graduate students, more and more the color versus black and white disappeared, and it became more, well, why are you still shooting film? Why aren't you shooting digitally, right? And a lot of times I'm used to these why questions as well, because I was raised a vegetarian. I'm still a vegetarian, and I can't tell you how many times I was around someone who said, why don't you eat meat? Or, oh, you sure you don't want a taste of this bacon's delicious, and on and on and on. So it's something I also kind of got used to over time and maybe adjusted to. But maybe now more than ever, this sort of debate about so-called analog versus so-called digital, or the kind of workflow comes up and up. So I've broken this down into some categories, and I'll just read through what I sort of organized this around, and then I'll start going through the presentation. So like digital, commercial and commercial and editorial photography, and what we take over from that and how that trickles down, talk about that. Technical qualities, role in education, role in culture. What do you want from photography, and how does this kind of play into it? The idea of a discipline or a practice or versus practice. Printing, inkjet versus working in the darkroom. Negative perceptions about one or the other, cost of one or the other, digital being easier or limitless in its possibilities, the zen of the darkroom, the problem with planned obsolescence built into cameras and stuff that we're dealing with these days, new practitioners coming in, and what does it mean to be taking up analog now, and then sort of tying it all together with a mix of an integrated approach of a workflow, and maybe talking a little bit about belief system and the character of why you might do one thing or the other. So I'll start sharing my screen. Let's see here. And start going through, again, not as many slides today, but still have some. Starting off with this Ansel Adams one that you might have seen on Instagram if you're following me. And so I think the first sort of thing I want to talk about is my position within this, that when I started school, film photography was the only game in town. This is a photograph of me taken with this little digital camera I was using back in 2001. But I early on was using digital technology for things, and Rob Steinberg, who's on here, we can talk about maybe a company that we were doing where we were making fine art inkjet prints for people using an iris printer. So I really sort of wound up being mixed in this world of and the transition from analog film photography to digital. And as I said, the years I was at Columbia from 2006 till just last year, when I first came in, we were all had to take turns every week cleaning the color processor, and everyone was doing analog. Then within 4 years of that, the color processor was gone. We were using inkjet prints, but everyone was still shooting film and scanning and making their prints either on the inkjet printer or maybe in the darkroom, but scanning was already taking over. And then by the time I left, no one was using the scanner hardly ever. I mean, maybe once or twice a semester, someone would scan in some film, but almost everyone was shooting digitally. And the black and white darkrooms, which my first year of grad school, I had to fight to get access to one. By the end, there'd be like maybe one person using it through the course of 2 years, like one or two people would of the grad students would use it. So I definitely saw the way this was tapering off. Um, I have this picture up from Pulp Fiction, thinking again about this idea of preferences. This is this famous scene where he talks about how he doesn't want to eat bacon because pigs are a filthy animal, and he's going on and on about how great bacon is, and how it's why wouldn't you take a taste, right? So, digital photography has obviously come a long way. And I think that um, similar to the arc of photography trying to fight its way into the art world, into the museums and the galleries, and to hold on and have cachet and be taken seriously, digital also went through a similar arc where, at the beginning, people didn't take it very seriously either because the quality wasn't good enough or because, it was always those sorts of things like, well, I can get better quality out of a 4x5 or a 35mm camera in the darkroom. Why would I want to shoot digital? Doesn't make any sense. And then the printing started to catch up, and then the cameras started to catch up. And then it was maybe too prohibitively expensive. You had to spend too much on a good digital camera and a good printer that you're going to, have to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get an equivalent amount of quality. And that's really all sort of gone out the window, right? Um, Really now, all in the commercial editorial side, of course, is digital. And if you were a wedding photographer, if you're a commercial sports photographer, anything like that, you're going to be shooting digitally, obviously, because of all of the added benefits. I was at a US Open game once, and I saw the pit of sports photographers down there, and they were uploading to the whichever magazine they were working for or newspaper, and then they were getting a call on their cell phone from the photo editor telling them they needed to move over somewhere else and they wanted a different shot. And they set up and moved, and I saw them like get the next shot, upload it into the cloud, and the whole thing was going on. So obviously, there's just something inherent in that. And of course, as artists, we've always benefited from the commercial world and everything that was being done there trickling down to what the artist wanted to use. And, we are going to be able to benefit from all of these high-end digital cameras getting cheaper as it moves through that field. And so there is that kind of trickle-down effect, which is now, I would say, stymied or stopped in the analog film world. There's no commercial real reason for any of these companies to be investing incredible amounts of money in new analog film technology. There's not going to be the great new and larger coming out in the coming years, I would say, right? And yet we see, for those of us who are educators, that there's still a lot of interest in darkrooms. And this was an article in the New York Times from a couple of years ago that was widely shared about how high school darkrooms are getting used more and more. Ilford's doing incredibly well because of the narrowing in the field and everything else. Students being engaged with it. I think we've all had the experience of, you're teaching someone photography and they already are using their smartphone and they already maybe have even like an inkjet printer in their dorm room. It's not that exciting. You bring them into the darkroom, and that first time putting the print into the developer and it comes up, or the first time they pull that film out of the reel and they messed up loading the camera and it was all ruined, that built-in anxiety about failure and loss really does do something to engage their brain in a different way, right? So I think there is this role in education that's pushed it forward. But it's also changed our visual culture. I mean, this was a kind of got a lot of attention. This is back in 2011. This article was in Petapixel about this guy, Andre Rebello, who uploaded some Henry Cartier-Bresson photographs to these Flickr group. And he got just, everyone was killing it. Like, it's too blurry. Why is it so out of focus? You know, too bad, nicely composed, but too blurry. You know, we've come to internalize this way that the digital cameras are rendering everything with very fast ISOs, so you can get the shutter speed's always what you want, and you know, stopping action, super crisp lenses, etc. So that's trickled down into just our culture and the way we visually expect certain photographs to look, where you know, people who are grown up on that look at some HCB photograph and they're like, oh, sorry, Henry Cartier-Bresson, and like, that's, you know, not not up to spec, right? And also within education, like this is kind of famous maxims from the chair that Charles Traub, head of the program at SVA, published. It's in a book about teaching, and it's also just widely available. This is from his website. And a lot of push in education to embrace digital and, you know, be on the cutting edge. Two of the rules in here, like if it can be done digitally, do it. Don't use alternative processes. If it ain't straight, do it in the computer. Even saying do it in color if it's out in the real world. So there is this kind of a push on that end. And I would also say, of course, we're seeing this move to no longer having it siloed as a photography department, but having this idea of lens-based media and, you know, things opening up so that if you're doing video, if you're doing anything else that uses a lens, we'll take you in, you're all part of the umbrella. And of course, you know, a lot of young teachers now are coming in, maybe they get an adjunct job teaching a photo one class that's in the darkroom, and it's not their practice. So they, you know, struggle to maybe remember how to load film, and now it's them trying to teach students how to use the darkroom, and they don't really understand it themselves. So how enthusiastic are they going to be in their portrayal of it, right? So that's an issue, I think, as well. You know, many heads of photography departments now don't even identify as photographers. I know at least 2 or 3 myself who they don't call themselves photographers, but they find themselves as the chair of a photo department. So, you know, it kind of muddies the waters, I'd say. That being said, I think all photographers have to embrace digital technology on one part or the other, right? We are in a digital age. I think Dennis Santella commented on Instagram, probably sarcastically, is it really the digital age? Well, I think we all have to like say that, of course we are. I mean, artists have to embrace the technology for something like a website. There's a website with Helen Levitt's photographs on it. Here's Yola Monaco Stockton's Instagram page, which she puts a lot of great work out on that. And, you know, you've got to be an ambassador for your own work. So if you want to participate in the culture and get your work out there, even if you want to publish a photo book, you're going to be making digital copies of prints or whatever. So I think it's unrealistic to say that you're just going to hand coat your own glass plates and make prints and nothing else and never share out into the digital world. So of course, you know, digital copy stands, offset printing, preparing your stuff for that. There's going to be some way that you're going to be embracing it and advocating for your work. There's no point in being a Luddite or even identifying as a Luddite just by the fact that you're still shooting film, right? So this is where I think we should start talking about, you know, what do you want from photography? And a lot of the narratives of stuff that people bandy about with digital versus film, almost everyone you can throw down and say, look, like here's a Muybridge photograph where he's sandwiching 2 negatives to get so he can get some clouds in the sky. I mean, people have been doing anything that you talk about that's seems to be overly analog or overly digital. There's examples you can find all throughout the history of photography. So that, you know, that usually doesn't hold up. But what is your practice? What do you want from it? Here's a Thomas Demand photograph If those of who aren't familiar with his work, he makes, these are all meticulously made paper sculptures that he then photographs. So everything you see in this is a piece of paper that's folded and lit. This one as well. Does this particularly call for, having a practice where you're shooting film and going into the darkroom? Probably not. I mean, I think a lot of these conceptual practices, you'd have a hard time making an argument for, saying, oh, you should be shooting film, right? Another photographer, Taryn Simon, this is from, I forget the name, it's got a long name for this body of work, but, these are, these photographs, I wouldn't say that her engagement with the practice and what she's trying to get out of the photographs necessarily needs to have film photography as a background, right? And we've seen this going on for a long time. This is Gursky, and this photograph's famous because at one point, at least, it was the most expensive photograph ever made. But he was very early on doing these digital manipulations. Oh, I threw Jory Olsman in there next. These digital manipulations of photoshopping things out, and people's minds are getting blown. Or there was a photographer like Jerry Olsman who's been doing these sorts of things in the darkroom for years. I think he's an interesting example of one where once the Photoshop tools kind of came out and became available, then, his work seemed less fantastic and the skill level kind of fell away and people don't talk about it in as much anymore. There's the other Gursky with the up in the ceiling, all the stuff done in, right? Or Jeff Wall. I think if you have a more painterly practice, and I could make an argument, we could talk about this, that a lot of digital workflow and digital work is more of a painterly, additive, painterly process. And if that's your engagement with the medium and what you're attracted to be able to go back and rework images or combine multiple exposures into a seamless kind of integrated thing, he's literally taking this from this Hokusai or inspired by this Hokusai painting, but that's a much more kind of painterly additive versus selective version of a practice where I think digital makes a lot more sense. Of course, maybe it's more from you're drawing from cinema, right? Gregory Crutzen, he was shooting 8x10 film here, but I doubt he's doing that anymore. Just he needed it at the time, but all about scanning in and changing and manipulating little areas like film photography. I mean, it's like cinema would be doing with multiple exposures and building sets and doing all these sorts of things. And when I think of cinema, maybe is your inspiration more on the side of, cinema verite and like Breathless, Godard, the camera set up in the world getting stuff? Or is it more of a modern take of, not to be pedantic or not to be mean-spirited and say that it's either Breathless and Godard or Marvel, but there is this idea that, okay, we can't get it all in one shot. We're going to add stuff in later, and then we're going to be able to make these, fantastic, perfect kind of images together. Something to think about where your inspiration lies. Similar to if your physical person is going into dance, are you wanting to do Cirque du Soleil, or you want to be a ballerina and so all you need is a bar against the wall, or do you need, insane sets and everything else? What does the practice argue for, in other words, right? So the darkroom is something that you might be attracted to or not, and it's something that, plays into all of these things. The next part of it I was going to talk about, this is a very low resolution picture, but I threw it in for fun. This is Graham Nash, which, boy, he's been doing inkjet printing since late 80s, early 90s, and he's the one who coined the term giclée after he's trying to make it sound even fancier. But there they are now using Epson printers, I guess. But, with inkjet printing, it's sometimes people just want to discount and say, oh, it's super easy, just plug it in and print. But anyone's actually tried to make good inkjet prints, no, there is this level of information and technology that you have to really get good at before you can make a good print in the darkroom. It's not just as they say in the advertising. But one sort of thing that I might throw in that's a semi-controversial, when I go back, is that, what does it mean to make an inkjet print, call it whatever you will, dice, any of those kind of fancy terms, versus a photograph, right? So a photograph in the darkroom, light making a drawing, it is a photographic print. If you rip out a page of a photo book, you don't think you've got someone's photograph, you think you have, an offset printed version of that photo. So there is something to that engagement with the medium. This is a photograph by my friend Eileen Quinlan, shoots 4x5 and degrades the negatives and makes analog prints, not herself, but her printer does in the darkroom. And her level of engagement with the medium, she needs to have that, physical negative to work with, or this kind of famous Irving Penn silver gelatin print. There's something to the quality of a silver gelatin print that, clearly now the digital printing is at the level or well beyond what you can do in the darkroom, especially if you're making big prints. But you can make huge prints. You don't have to worry about aerial diffusion. You don't have to worry about the enlarger moving, all these sorts of things. But they have a different quality, and it's kind of interesting now that even despite Roland Barthes and the age of mechanical reproduction, the photo print made in the darkroom is more like a craft object now, like a handmade object, which is, I think, interesting. The next thing that everyone always brings up is cost. Well, digital is so much cheaper than shooting film and doing everything else. Yes and no. I think it breaks down in different ways. Of course, film, if you have to pay to have your film processed, that adds a lot. But, look at this Hautemüller rag paper, 25 sheets, $89.60, or slightly larger, $175. That's not including, the ink set, right? Full set of 11 inks, $1,200 or more. It's not on the printing side, it's not so clear cut which one is costing you more, especially after you've invested in all of the stuff. And of course, what are you going to get out of your inkjet printer? 5 years, 10 years tops. But once you have your enlarger and your sink and everything set up, it could last you the rest of your life. So there's sunk costs as well. I threw this in here as another thing. We're talking now more about how digital has this built-in freedom where you can go out with several memory cards and maybe you can spend a weekend shooting thousands of photographs versus maybe traveling with 20 rolls of film and being more limited. And I put this in for this kind of like spray and pray idea of like, yes, maybe you can shoot thousands and thousands of photographs, but I don't know if that's necessarily a good thing, right? So this idea of like digital being this limitless possibilities and anything that you could do, I say the downside is that sometimes people talk about the negative side of still shooting film. This is from the movie Wonder Boys, and if you haven't seen it, it's a great film, but his character starts off writing his great novel that's gone on for thousands of pages, and he's using this old electric typewriter, and they kind of make fun of him for it. And later at the end of the movie, he's come to see the light and he switches over to a laptop and he's using a word processor, and it's the sign of growth and embracing the times. So there is this idea that maybe you're holding on to old habits if you're still using the darkroom, or you're too focused on the technical side and you're not embracing just going with the flow, right? So it's something to think about if you're still shopping for film, that maybe that you're, not up to speed. But I also think that this idea that the refrain of it's easier, that all of the technical things of high ISO getting out of your way and being able to do everything is, yes, it opens up possibilities for low light work, but I'm not so sure that easier always necessarily means better, right? This is from Woody Allen's movie Sleeper, and it's the Orgasmatron. If you haven't seen that movie, they're just coming out having thrilled. So, I mean, if you want an orgasm, masturbation is easy and readily available, right? Much so other way of getting that orgasm. But I don't necessarily think we would agree that's always the best, right? I mean, sure, you could talk about it's easy to have a digital camera, inkjet printer, and a laptop. You could travel anywhere and make photographs and prints. But it never stopped Robert Frank or Carlton Watkins with his donkeys with his glass plates. So there's ways of getting around it. I'm not so sure easier means hallelujah, we're there, right? You can also explore this idea of creative limitation culture. And we've talked about this on the earlier ones where we're talking about the camera as an instrument, that sometimes that feedback and limitations spawns creativity because you're pushing back against challenges and therefore you're growing because of it. Not to say that there aren't challenges in the digital world, but there are. Low ISO example. The other thing that I find really problematic, say, is once you fully embrace a digital workflow, you're now into this era of planned obsolescence, right? This is my Leica 3F. It's from 1952, has a newer lens on it. It works just as good as the day it came out of the factory, if not better with the newer lens. But if you read if you watch this documentary, The Light Bulb Conspiracy, or you think about digital cameras that are only 10 years old, or if you're trying to use a scanner and connect it up to, you might be still trying to run OS 9 or some very old Windows or find a SCSI card. This technology, you have to stay on the cutting edge of it. And it is every couple of years, you might look around and say, oh my God, I have to throw everything away and start over again. So you're entering that cycle, right? As opposed to maybe being happy with a camera that's 50 to 70 years old and equipment that's been around forever. And I think that sneaks into stuff. You have to worry about, is this file format going to be around for a while? You have to worry about, is an electrical impulse going to go off and wipe out my hard drive because my building got struck by lightning, or et cetera, et cetera. So there are all these other built-in sort of anxieties that go along with this idea of, better ink sets because things are now more archival, all this planned obsolescence or having to live on the cutting edge. That could be, it just changes your relationship to your medium, I think. There's an Adam Bartos photograph of a darkroom. He went around photographing people's darkrooms. So the darkroom, I think, is also something else to talk about. I called it the Zen of the darkroom. I mean, there's something about going into that space. For every photographer who worked for years in a darkroom and comes back and says, you know what, I'm so happy I don't have to go in the darkroom anymore and spend all those hours. There's equal number of people that look forward to that time spent in the darkroom. Every year I do a Christmas card print since 2006, I guess, inspired by Tom Roma, who gave them out to the graduate students. And this year I was worried how I was going to get that done. I got access to the UNM darkroom. I had spent a whole day in there making these prints, doing all this stuff. There's no doubt I could have also scanned the negative or taken a digital photograph and printed out the 100 and so 5x7 prints in an afternoon or an hour or two, instead of spending all day in the darkroom. But anyone who's had that practice in that time, there's also something kind of seductive about it or precious about it. And I think you have a hard time seeing the equivalent of walking into a beautifully appointed studio with inkjet printers everywhere and scanners and stuff and having that same kind of feeling. You might be excited that they've got the technology, but I'm not so sure you'd have that same the relationship to the space. Again, that might be talking about my bias, right? So on the positive benefit side of shooting film, I think there's this idea of there is a bit of an extra learning curve, right? So, let's say you decide you want to pick up the saxophone, you love John Coltrane, you're going to have to be very passionate about playing the saxophone to get through learning the breathing exercises, trying to make the notes, do all of that. It's not going to be so casually taken up. And, as a result, I think, well, there's always Clinton and other saxophone players, but there's, the people who really go for it jump wholeheartedly in. And I do believe that, by lowering the skill set, it just changes who has access to the technology and maybe the level of passion involved before people proceed further. Likewise, you're going to get slowed down by the technology of film. You're going to be slowed down, You're not going to get the feedback right away. That's the chimping idea of looking at the back of your digital camera immediately to see what you had. You might be weeks, months, could even be years before you see a contact sheet of some film that you shot the other day. And that changes, the feedback loop of that changes everything. Of course, the labor cost, right? If you know that you're going to have to spend X amount of hours processing film and making contact sheets and prints, it's going to play into when you're photographing, you might be like, nah, maybe I won't make this photograph, or maybe I'm not going to just, take 20 pictures of this piece of trash I found on the ground, because that's going to equal more labor and more work, right? And we already talked about last week or the week before, we were talking about cameras, and I think Yoav brought up the thing of shooting with a 4x5 and the relationship with the sitter. All of these things play back into some positive benefits of, shooting film. But I also think there's this idea of a connection to the history of the medium, and this idea of a discipline versus just a practice. If you have a photographic practice, it might mean that you use a camera, this sort of lens-based idea of approaching the world with a camera. But if you think about it more as a discipline, then you're going to have this connection to people who were working with it before, and the stories that you inherit from them, and maybe the equivalence that you feel there, right? Now, I do think, ahead of myself, I do think there is a pressure to go digital, and that's where that why question comes back up, why you get questioned about it, why you're still shooting film. And there's an implication maybe that you're an antiquarian, or that you're not being relevant. In some sense, this could relate to the marketplace and the art market, which I don't care that much about, but it also, for those of us who are teachers, it ties into that too. Like, there are many instances at Columbia where the idea that we were still teaching film photography had a negative implication, as if we were trying to hold things back. Even though we're not teaching at a trade school, or teaching in an art department, there's still an idea that maybe you're trying to, that your views about the world and your views about the art world are a little closed-minded, right? Because you're not embracing digital, so you must be closed-minded about other things. You're a Luddite again, going back to this retroactive way of thinking about things, which I, of course, think is ridiculous, but I do believe it's a real perception, right? So I wanted to throw in the other side of things, which is there is this DRECK of the sort of work that's either the self-conscious work about the death of photography, and people do bad prints with hair on them and scratches just to say, hey, it's analog, look, I'm talking about this thing that's dying. Or this vintage film overlays, where you can spend $99 to get a bunch of different grains and scratches to put on your digital photograph to make it look more authentic and real or something. And that's not isolated. There's quite a bit of this out there. So there's something, something to that, which I think is pretty insane. But I also know that, I'm coming from this position of someone who started off where analog was the only game in town, as I mentioned. But my office was right next to the Leroy Neiman Center for Print Studies, where people were making etchings. There was no doubt that if you had a drawing, you want to make a reproductions of a drawing, you could go up to the copy, the Xerox machine and make multiple copies. Yet still people are transferring over to etching, putting in the acid, etching the plate, inking the plate, making etchings. Why? Why? Just shouldn't they have given that up now that there's other ways of reproducing line work? Well, of course, there's something to an etching, and we're going to hold on to it just the same way I think we will to something about an analog print made in the darkroom. And then there's also this other kind of thing happening now. Speaking of the prints in the Neiman Centers, people are taking digital photographs or scanning and making digital equivalents of their work to then print out with Picture Rico and use to make alternative processes. So it's not that if you start off digitally, you can't go to an analog photo print at the end. It's certainly possible. maybe it's a totally different kind of workflow, but something to think about. So I think there is an idea of having these kind of mix of a workflow back and forth together. I have two photographs of from the photographer Joseph Michael Lopez, who I knew as a grad student at Columbia, who's has this sort of hybrid integrated approach, I would say, where you're shooting film, having it processed, but he never makes a darkroom print. Everything's scanned in and then either inkjet prints or maybe directly to screen. But he still wants that 35 millimeter, Tri-X film processed in Xstall. He still wants that feel and look for it, but he's never going to make an analog print, right? And there's a number of people who are still working that way. And so we'll see now as scanners start to die off. I know people are making prints and photographing them or photographing their negatives, but there's, challenges built into that as well. So the last sort of thing I wanted to wrap up and say that I don't believe it's an equivalent. I don't believe that, shooting film, that whole workflow of going into the darkroom, making these prints, there is a certain craft to it and there's a certain thing to it that is different than a digital workflow. There's no doubt about it. And I just watched this yesterday. There's this channel about Grandpa Amu, and had someone's grandfather in China who sits around making all this incredible stuff. He made a bridge out of bamboo and some other stuff. And, you could go up to the guy and say, hey, don't you know there's power tools and drills and more modern things to use? And, there's something about the craft of it. And I was fascinated to watch this video as much as I watch other woodworking stuff as well. And so, there is this, I think there's room for this kind of an embracing of, using this technology still. And maybe to synthesize everything together before we open it up to questions or comments is that to me, I do think there is something about a belief system built in there. We have an embarrassment of riches now. If you want to be a photographer, there's so many ways to make photographic images and approach things that there's almost no limitation into which route you want to go. And so when you're presented with multiple choices that are equally good in that sense, it really comes down to the character of what you want to do. How do you want to approach things? What's going to feed your particular creative output, right? Why did Atjeh continue to photograph with glass plates when clearly he could have, had a more modern equivalent? On the other side, would Atjeh really be better if he had a Canon 5D or even a Leica to walk around Paris with? I mean, we could make arguments to the cows come home about that, but intrinsically, I think belief systems are important for creative work, and that every artist, even to take up a creative field and decide that you want to make art, is a belief system, that you have something to say and something to say about it. So, why not continue that on to how you're making the work as well? So even though I do think it tends to become almost a religious or political statement about which way you're going and the great why questions keep coming up, in the end, I think it's less important than the work itself, right? And however the artist tends to engage with the medium, so be it. Phew. All right, so as I promised, fewer sides, more talking. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So those are the kind of topics I thought it was worth hitting. I wanted to make sure, hey, Claudio and Robin are on. I wanted to make sure some people were coming today who were shooting film and have not given it up, but have embraced digital and think it's, the greatest thing since sliced bread. And, maybe other people like myself who are still shooting film and happy to do so. So I need to take a drink of water, and you unmute to talk, and happy to hear what people have to say. Claudio, do you want to unmute and talk?
Yeah, so having started with making albumin prints and an 11 by 14 camera and 4 by 5 foot albumin prints in cloth. I kind of don't get film. Having started with digital in 1991, the liberation of digital, downsides aside, you know, obsolescence, it's expensive, it's more ephemeral, but shooting tethered in the studio with live images on screen is just an accelerant. And when I think of film, I always think about the Kurt Vonnegut story, Handicapper General, if any of you know it, but it was the great leveler. So if you were a ballerina, you had an unfair advantage. So you would have to wear weights on your ankles. And if you were a musician with perfect pitch, you would have to wear headphones with cymbals banging in your ears. So everybody was equal. And the idea of an artificial constraint, I understand the discipline of it, but I don't get the advantage of it.
Again, I think it has a lot to do, the reason I couched it under the idea of a practice or a discipline is, you know, what are you trying to, you know, what's your engagement or what are you trying to make with it? And I think, you know, knowing the work that you're making now and working in the studio, as you said, tethered to the camera and also post-production kind of work on the stuff, it makes all the sense in the world. I don't see why you would want to not use that, right? So I think about it less in terms of, I do know that Kurt Vonnegut story. I think also if you're too smart, and you get like a headache every like 10 minutes if you start thinking too much about things. But I don't see it as limitations in the sense of hobbling yourself. I see it in terms of a limitation that is going to, it's like the sand in the oyster that's going to maybe make the pearl. I think there's limitations in all of these technologies and that you have to find ways of working around. But on the digital versus analog side, I think almost everyone talks about it being easier or freeing you up, more freedom. And maybe a lot of times the problem with people's photographs aren't that they were being limited by the technology. It was maybe limited by something else.
Well,
Isn't the history of photography, and then just one last thing, but if you started, you had to be a chemist in 1840 to make a photograph, and the whole history of the medium is easier and more accessible with higher volumes and less restriction. So where do you peg your technology? Is it collodion? Is it color film? Kodachrome, where you couldn't do it without a factory? I think it's an artificial constraint that I understand the idea. I just totally don't get why you would do that to yourself. There's a photographer, I think his name was Johnson, remember from the early days of digital, and he was a nature photographer, and his claim to practice was he wouldn't move as much as a twig when he was out in the world photographing. And I thought, fuck's wrong with you, you know?
Yeah, I think that's why it goes back to this idea of also of a belief system, right? I mean, there's people, maybe not a twig, but there's people who, for the way they approach things, they don't want to alter anything, right? If they're walking down the street and they see something almost perfect, they're like, oh, I wish that had been on the other side of the street, then it would have been a great photograph, but oh well, I'll walk away. And there's the other person who will pick it up and move it over there, or there's someone who'll tell them to do the same thing again. So I think that just all goes back to your, you know, again, belief system, what you want to throw together. Joel, you had something?
Well, yeah, I mean, I approach it from the concept that I'll do anything and use anything to make a picture that will look the way that I want the picture to look at the end result. And then the process determines it. And I only recently, really recently found a use for digital cameras. The high ISO and the bigger sensors that are available now make a way of making pictures possible that weren't possible before, and shooting in available light in nighttime, low light situations, and making beautiful pictures that are described well is now possible to handhold it, in all honesty. But there are other things that I do where a big piece of film still looks like a big piece of film. And, you know, you scan it and then make a digital print from it. But it's a hybrid process, at least for me. But it all based on what you want the final thing to look like, I think. I don't think one, I think you go about it in two different ways. Either you're interested in the process, and so I want to shoot with this camera. All right, and then what do you shoot with a certain camera? A lot of people, when you use a panorama, I've used it for years and stuff, the little panoramic 35mm camera, Claudio has as well. And the talk was always, they're landscape cameras, panoramic cameras, landscape cameras. Then, well, you want to use that camera. What's interesting is, like, Kai's used it for doing these portraits, these film stills and stuff. I've used it for party pictures and street work. It's trying to take the machine out of what it's supposed to be. So that's one way of working. The other way of working is, okay, I'm going to use the machine that will create the thing that will look like the end product that I want it to look like. So I don't know if there's a right or wrong for either of it. And then the only other thing I just wanted to add is kind of on the digital end, the concept of being able to shoot in these situations where you don't need as much light, where you can expose thousands of images in a given day and stuff like that. There's a great interview. Sony in the early 90s did a documentary with cinematographers. It's called Visions of Light, which I don't think is available. It's on YouTube. Of course, it's like the lowest res version of the great documentary. And they interviewed all of the great living cinematographers who are still around in the 90s, going back to people who had been making films in the 40s up until, current day practitioners. And so they interview Nestor Almendros, who had this incredible career. He's a Cuban emigre, and he was friends with Terrence Malick, and he made movies for Francois Truffaut. And they asked him, Nestor, now that you can shoot in almost any light situations with very fast film stocks, and now it's going to be digital is coming out and stuff, what separates a great director of photography from any other director of photography? And he looked right in the camera and he said one word: taste. And that's still it. It's use whatever you use, but it's still the taste. It's the photographer or the artist. I mean, that's my take on it. I'll use whatever it takes to make a picture. I don't care, as long as it looks like what I want it to look like.
Yeah, there again, I think going right back to discipline and engagement with it, right? What are you prioritizing? And as I was preparing this today, every example I could come up with in one way or the other, I could easily think of the other equivalent. I mean, I know there's a lot of these young street photographers who are in love with, Winogrand or Friedlander or something, and they all go and buy Leicas, and some of them very quickly then switch over to, like a Fuji film, like fast digital camera, because they realize, again, they were into the idea of moving out in the world and photographing in a certain way, and that it wasn't that part of the instrument, and everything else wasn't what was holding him back or affecting it, right? And maybe that it would be an affectation to do the other thing. So Claudio, I called on you earlier, then we got distracted away. So I know you went through this process and, switching over to a medium format digital camera and getting rid of all this other stuff you had. And we can see your scanner and your inkjet printer behind you. So do you want to talk about that process and any stigma you may have felt along the way?
I think I go back to something you said a little earlier, which was that there's this question of the argument for a particular practice. And so I think for me, the more I kind of heard you talking about the different ways that people have engaged this question, right, the both sides of it, one of the things that I keep coming back to is the fact that I happen to be an undergrad right at the cusp of the switch over to digital, right? So like I made color prints in the darkroom. I made black and white prints in the darkroom, but I also got to use digital cameras, and I got to make the first inkjet prints that they had at the Cooper Union when they first bought inkjet printers. So I had a particular relationship to both things, right? When I got out of school, I had no, I didn't have any money. So, I worked and I ended up buying a digital camera because I couldn't shoot film. It just was prohibitively expensive. I didn't have a darkroom. There was no way of making that. And the camera that I bought then was the camera that got me into Columbia. So I was shooting digital when I got there. At Columbia, I think when I was there, there was a lot of, I think everybody was shooting film and scanning. And so there was a very particular kind of culture that, I don't know if I would say that I got pressured, but I saw the difference in quality, and that was enough for me to think, well, maybe this is something to sort of jump on. And anyway, to make a long story short, I go back to that question of the argument for practice and asking yourself, well, what is it that you want out of your work? And so I asked myself the question a couple years ago of, am I interested in the print, like the material, right? The like making of the print, or am I interested in the image? And because I was kind of going towards books anyway, and that's really where my practice is. That's what I want to do, is just make books. I sort of found that it didn't matter, and that it was more about a look, as Zolt said, like it's more about like, well, what is the camera doing for the subject that you're, or the medium doing for the subject that you're trying to capture. And so for me, once that kind of became clear, I started to think about the work, right? Like how much time it took to do film photos. Then, I have my scanner back there. So then scanning, spotting, all these kind of things. And then eventually I think because of teaching and because of wanting to do color, I switched over to digital cameras again. And that immediacy that's been described, the way that the images are rendered, like I think things have caught up to such a degree that I'm not seeing enough of a difference for what I want, for the idea of a print in a book, right? As opposed to a print in some kind of physical form. And I just, I kind of made the choice, and I think I'm pretty happy with it in terms of that. Like there's an immediacy, I can make as many pictures as I need to. And I think that the quality is there, so that that question of would it look better or some other way if I shot film is no longer an issue. It's not a problem. You also mentioned planned obsolescence, which I think you're right. There is some of that with digital cameras, but I'm shooting with a 9-year-old medium format digital camera that uses an old CCD sensor. And I find that the quality for me is equal, if not greater, to medium format scanned anyway. And so then again, that question of, I could buy another, that's an 8-year-old camera. Imagine if I bought something that was 5 years old, 3 years old, a year old. Again, I go back to the issue of that practice. And for me, the practice is the image and the way that the images relate to each other in terms of a narrative. And for that, it doesn't quite matter, right? So I'm doing the thing that is more expedient, where I'm able to shoot in a way that I want to shoot. And it has a particular quality that I think is still relevant and connected. That being said, I still have my Imicon. No one's ever going to take that away from me. I still have all my film in boxes. I'm still working and making books out of the film that I've shot. So again, I think it depends on what it is that you're trying to say, as opposed to what it is that, what the practice is as a physical thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to note that for the most part, unless someone's photographs are somehow self-consciously referencing the way they were made, that for the audience, it really shouldn't matter that much. I mean, as photographers, we can't help ourselves. It's like going to a movie with a filmmaker. They're going to like cut up everything, talk about the editing, talk about everything that was wrong. I think any one of you I've ever been to a show with, we go up and we look at the prints real close. Maybe someone talks about how they use too much unsharp masking or blah, 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 blah. But I mean, in the end, it really should be about, the photograph, right? And not be caught up into whether or not this person, used whichever process or algorithm or paper or film, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think this has much more to do with the maker and talking about what is the process for the maker versus what's the end result for the audience, say, or something like that, the reception of the work going forward, and any idea of quality. And I do think digital had to fight against that because, for a while, MoMA or whatever wouldn't buy an inkjet print because it wasn't archival, or they'd ask for multiple copies or all these things. And I think one of the things that's really nice that we can talk about this now is that pretty much everything is either level or digital is better. So there's no more kind of self-conscious talking about, why isn't, why are you using that inferior technology, et cetera, right?
Hey,
Dennis. Oh yeah,
hey,
who
Well,
was
the
that?
question is really, are you an artist because you want to work on yourself? In the Gurdjieff, sort of, is that your role in life? Or are you an artist because you have something to say in that language is what you're delivering as a print or as an image? And I think they're very different objectives.
Well, I would say, like, for example, I was thinking about William Burroughs, right? William Burroughs and cutting up, writing stuff down there, cutting it up and splicing things together. That was his process. If you're reading Naked Lunch, you're going to receive that. But, are you going to call up Burroughs or call him up, I guess, and say, hey, you shouldn't be
luck with
working that
that.
way. Why are you bothering? You can just, type it all in or something. I don't think that's not part of it. If that's what it takes for him to get to the result he wants, we tip our hat. Good for you. That's why I think it's less about a critique of how they're getting there, and again, which I think is what makes it more of an internal conversation for the individual artist versus yeah, I certainly I don't believe in like selling your pain, like, oh, I worked in the darkroom for 20 hours and I did this, I did that, therefore this is valuable. I think that all those arguments are bullshit.
Yeah, photographers, I think, are particularly prone to selling their pain. I made 100 prints before I got one, which to me was always, well, I guess you're not very good.
Yeah.
Kai, I
Dennis.
think from the,
Was
this is Tom.
Oh, wait.
Hey, from like an educator's standpoint,
Mhm.
I think the program that I was previously at in Texas, we had a darkroom class. We moved into a new facility. There was a strong push for a larger, well-ventilated darkroom and a larger, well-ventilated alt process area. I'll leave alt process to the side, but the thought was it was still, the important thing was they were going to shoot on a 4x5 and get a 4x5 experience that was much different than what their digital camera would give them. And then there would be some guys usually that would then sort of latch on to getting some sort of like 35mm camera or whatever, and they may shoot black and white on that, or a lot of the time they just shot color and then scanned all that stuff in. When I came here to Wisconsin, and I've got a photo 1 class that's 35mm black and white, and I think this semester it's part darkroom, part digital. But I think it's about like an educational experience in a lot of ways. Like there's part of me that says if I were to say we're not teaching black and white anymore, all of that space would go away, right? And I'd maybe end up in a classroom full of computers or something. Like I wouldn't have a photo place. But I think that like it's not really like a lot of photo majors, but it's this idea of, I can't tell you how many times I've interacted with other faculty members and I've said, hey, I've got this class, if you've got any students, and they're like, wow, I didn't know we still had a darkroom. I remember taking darkroom in college. And it's like, it's an experience that sticks with people really no matter what. And I feel like on that basis alone, it's worth keeping. I think the flip side of that is that, I give them cameras, but they still need to spend like about an extra $150 to take the class. And I think in this day and age, that's becoming more and more of a thing to think about, which is unfortunate. But also along the lines of like cinematography and all that, a friend of mine helped make a documentary. It was called Side by Side. I was looking it up. It came out in 2012. It was about like film versus digital in cinema. And Keanu Reeves interviewed a lot of different people. And it was the first time I got done watching something where it was sort of like pro film, pro digital. I was like, I agree with everyone. And it is sort of, it really is like everything that George Lucas did made sort of sense. Everyone that still uses film, it makes sense. you know, but when I saw Roma, what, a year or two ago, I'm like, I want a still digital camera with that sensor. Like the quality of the black and white that he got out of that RE sensor, just, I was like, you know, if I was really rich, I'd be like, put that in a Leica, and then, you know, then you've got the digital camera I want, you know. But
yeah, it's not the sensor, it's the cinematographer. It's still the
that
person.
sensor, though, I mean, that
It's not. It's you could do it with a red. You could do it with any other.
but still,
camera.
it's that idea of that, the sensor, and that, you know, the size of the sensor plays into it, right? I mean, I'm using a 10-year-old crop film sensor, Fuji X100, that looks a certain way because it's 12 megapixels, and I don't want to get rid of it because it looks a certain way. So
Yeah,
but yeah, it's just
sensor,
sort of
the
interesting.
sensor does matter. In
Yeah.
medium format, 80 megapixel sensor is definitely going to be a different thing. But collodion is a different thing than albumin, is a different thing than Kodachrome. Photography has always been about different things. And it's been every decade since 1829. And people just try and peg an era with what they mean. And photography has always been about technology, more so than most arts. And it's been more ephemeral than most arts. And people tend to have these arguments about where in the history of photography they properly belong. And I think what we're all hearing is it doesn't matter. Get on your bike and do what you like. And it's about the work. And if it's about photograms from Anna Adkins, or whether it's the silver cigarette butts, or the arguably far better platinum cigarette butts that Ben did, you know, doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. Makes you happy, fine. Your film's going away. You may have to start melting down the family silver if you want to shoot film, fine.
We'll have to make our own forge. Claudio, did you have something you wanted to add? I saw you unmute.
I just wanted to say that I think we've all kind of, for the most part, have decided on a kind of practice in the way that we want to do that. And we have different experiences going back years and years and years to using different cameras, using film, using digital, using this and that and the other. As someone who teaches, as an educator, I actually feel really, really strongly that learning the darkroom first is incredibly important. That's an argument that a lot of places are having. And I just got a new job at the University of Miami where they don't have any darkrooms whatsoever, right? The idea is that their students come in digitally and they leave digital. And so that'll be an interesting way for me, it'll be interesting to see how that kind of translates to certain issues of time, of engagement, of discipline, as you mentioned, right? That kind of come through the process of having to develop the film, to wait, to kind of deal with the process, right? So it's not so immediate. I think in terms of teaching, I mean, if I had my druthers, I would never get rid of film whatsoever. I think that there's something very, you know, interesting and formative that happens in that space. I think once you get into a practice situation, right? Once you get into making artwork, whatever that is, I think it is a free-for-all. It should be anything. It should be whatever makes the picture correct for you. But there's something really amazing about the darkroom. I teach both analog and digital courses, and there's a very, very different thought process that goes into that. And those students of mine who have taken my analog class first and then my digital class have a very different idea of how images mean things and the kind of, as you say, like not just shooting for the sake of shooting. That changes very dramatically from those students who just come in digital. It's a very different idea. I think eventually they get to the same place, but they don't come to it at the same rate.
Yoav, did you have something I saw you on mute earlier?
Yeah, I had a lot, and I can talk now for 3 hours, and I'm not going to do it. I can say that I disagree with a lot of things that were said here, both by RJS and Zolt, that we're talking about technique and practicality. And I agree. There's absolutely one reason to use film cameras in terms of practicality, that you don't need batteries. Other than that, it doesn't make any sense in terms of practical reasons to use film. Having said that, I think that using film is a decision of process, of waiting, of having a physical thing, of working, of a lot of other things other than practical how the image looks like. Because as you've seen, I can make any kind of digital files look like it was a film picture, and this is not the way. That's not why I use film. I agree that in terms of an educational tool, it's proper, but also working with clay, I think it's a good educational tool. I disagree that photography has been about technique, the same as cooks. It doesn't matter really what is the pan they're using eventually. So I think that, yes, the image does matter, but also the practice, the process, things that I'm not willing to give up, regardless the cost. This is not part of my reason to use film or not using film. As sometimes I use darkroom prints and sometimes I use digital prints. Sometimes I use large format and sometimes I use small format. I think that unfortunately we start talking more and more about practicality and quality. And I don't think this is what keep people using film. I think a major part of it is the magic of working with film. I think that people are still fascinated with the physical negative and the uncertainty and the fact that you're going to photograph and you don't see it right away. Those things I think still keep people interested. Kai also said that Ilford is doing great. Great, they're doing okay. They did much better 25 years ago, right? When every photojournalist would go out there and burn through 30 or 40 rolls of film, and tourists will use film, and this is the biggest market probably. So it's not done because of practical reasons, not at all. It's a matter of your connection to the process, the same as you talked about Leroy Neiman and prints versus photocopies. Same that people still make paintings, and still people make sculptures and not making them 3D models, right? Necessarily. I think that we have as people affinity to practice and to physicality and to the magic in making photographs. I know that this is how I started at age of 13 to take pictures with a 35mm film, and I still buy the same freaking film, more than 30 years later. It's a million times more expensive right now, and maybe I shoot a little bit less, but the magic is still there. And for me to develop film that cannot be changed with downloading a card to my computer and making a print and dodging and burning with the limitations. And I agree with you, inkjet print is probably better. A scan of a color film looks better than what you can do with a C print. That's true, but that's not the reason to do one thing or another. If I'll only work in terms of practicality, I will have frozen food in my freezer too, right? I don't need to cook. I'm just going to take it out of the freezer, put it in the microwave, and that's it. Sorry about this rant, but I was just,
Well, good. We wanted a rant. I wanted at least 2 or 3 rants, so we've had at least 2. That's good. Again, when I brought up this topic, I figured, all right, we can have some rants about it. Going back to this thing about the why, right? And the question about why people care about one way or the other how someone else is making their work, I think is also interesting. And this kind of qualitative decision making, and so-and-so. But this has been going on before digital. People using contacts, autofocus with flash, and they don't know anything about aperture and exposure, and they don't process their own film. I mean, people were making value judgments about other people, whatever whatever you're making the judgments about, that could be taken into account. So that part of the story is kind of old. I do think as artists, it makes sense to to put your a stake in the sand and say, all right, this is the kind of thing I want to make decisions about, and this is the part that I want to engage with. And whether or not you're doing free verse or you're doing rhyming poetry or imagist stuff, what are the things that you're deciding to spend your attention on, and that is going to have an effect on the work you produce, for better or for worse. And I think the one thing I do disagree with in general is whenever anyone tells me that it's an agnostic decision, that it makes no difference, that we're all photographers and it shouldn't matter if you're doing one or the other. I think that's where it falls apart, and I don't think that they're equal, but I also I'm not going to elevate one over the other for everybody and say this, that, and the other thing. I mean, my heart is much closer to what Yoav said, but I've also taught digital classes and I've seen them go extremely well. I just taught a black and white for digital photographer online class for Strudel Media Live, and people are making amazing work. There's all these extra tools and incredible algorithms out there. You know, there is a way to engage with it. I think that where you
I think it also goes back to, you know, I've been teaching for 16 years and I'm supposed to go back to teach view camera in the fall and photo one again. And I really hope that it's going to happen, because I'm frankly, you know, working on Zoom, and this is what I've been doing in the past 8 weeks. And I had to switch a photo to black and white 35mm to digital during this crisis. I don't think it's the same thing. I think that it's, you know, I think that also making obstacles and make it harder on them and struggle with, you know, when you can actually photograph. Not every time that you feel like you can photograph. Same as not every time you want to fly, you can fly. You know, there are limitations in life, and photography is no different in that sense. You know, I think there is something interesting about putting them in these limitations and not giving them, you know, I think it makes them better artists. So if you're talking about education, of course there's value for film. And somebody can say, okay, so, you know, I switched them to working with digital, and I told them, you're gonna shoot 2 rolls of film. That means 72 pictures, no editing, and I wanna see those contacts. So they will actually consider every one of those pictures, not because I'm being mean, and not that I think that film is quote unquote better. It's not better. It's just a different way of work. That's it.
Right. But as a teaching process, it's the best. I don't teach, but I don't think anything I should let a student touch a digital camera for like the first 2 years and make those contact sheets. I mean, you're the first person I've heard say this, which is, you know, so key. Make those contact sheets. Do not delete the bad pictures.
Right.
You don't learn shit from the good pictures. You learn from the bad pictures. You see the bad pictures and you say, how did I fuck that up? I got to do better next time. You delete that instantly because it's a little out of focus, a little blurry.
So falling on your face is as important as your successes.
It's probably more important in the end.
I think that's bullshit.
Okay.
You can make the contact sheet of a digital file just as well, and you can make the same mistakes. You can say only shoot 12 in the same way. You don't need the physical limitation for a philosophical problem.
As a student, they need constraints. If you're going to teach somebody,
as artists, I think as people we need constraints. I think that we're being babies to think that everything should come to us easily.
So the exercise is, I want you to take 12 photographs, not 13. I don't care how you do it, but don't do 13, and we're going to deal with those 12. Doesn't mean.
No, you're being pedantic. It's not about that. That's not what it's about. It's about having a structure and a limit to it, and then not making pop decisions. I pull out contact sheets from 30 years ago and I look at stuff and I go, or I'll look at something from 30 years ago and go, you know what? That was an avenue that I didn't think of. But people don't do that digitally. They chimp. They look at the stupid screen. Oh, that sucks. I delete. This is a good picture because it looks like a picture.
Gary Winogrand
people look at pictures, they make pictures because they look like pictures. And that's the wrong reason to make them.
Died with 3,000 rolls of undeveloped film. You know, it doesn't matter what you use for a medium. It's how you approach the problem of being a creative. So you can have artificial constraints, you can have real constraints, you can have financial constraints.
We're talking about two different things. We're talking, this is about, Yoav was talking about students. What I was talking about was students in education too. After a point when you've been shooting long enough, then you make up your own mind. Do whatever you want that works for you. Who cares? Whatever the process is, that's what you're working towards. But if you're talking about with the constraints of students, then yeah, it's good. Yeah. That structure is good.
So I think it's interesting that we talk about the students only because then we're talking from a place of authority of like, oh, well, we know what the best way for them to become photographers is. And maybe we don't. I mean, just because that was the way we learned and came up with it, it doesn't necessarily mean there's not another way to do it, and that maybe it wouldn't even be superior. I mean, maybe when everyone's walking around with virtual reality goggles on all the time, then picking up they find some old iPhone sitting around and like, hey, this thing's kind of cool. You can only do this, that, and the other thing with it. I think it's easy for us as educators to say, this is the best way, the only way, et cetera, et cetera. I certainly agree with a lot of the values that we've been talking about in terms of that early stuff, but it's certainly yet to be proven. And 20 years from now, it might all be a moot point. So it's really hard to say one way or the other. I do believe that we have to be careful about this kind of thing of like passing judgment one way or the other, like this person is doing it the right way and this person isn't. I think it all goes back to your engagement with the medium. What do you want from it, and what's your particular discipline, and how does that feed what you're going to do, right? I think that's really the critical aspect of all of it.
Part of it is I'm not an educator.
No, neither am I.
I'm not interested in me. Why do you, how people learn, I think, is also to the idea that you teach people with this idea. Maybe that's, your role in life or in an institution, but how people learn is also very different. I never went to art school, never wanted to. That was me. Other people, it's a good way of making a living in the arts, or an adequate way. There are many different reasons to be in art education, but I don't think it has much to do with art other than getting your ticket punched to union.
That's pretty cynical.
Yep.
Wow, the art world is cynical too, I would say.
Well, so am I, but there's.
Well, let's see. Do we then have anyone argue for always shooting digitally and making Pictorico negatives and then making platinum prints? So maybe we'll have to invite someone else.
I've had Pictorico screw up enough, cause enough problems with the inkjet printers in a lab, just because of, I think it's Epson smudging ink issue that the former lab tech manager part of me says never do that, or I want to say only use that printer to do that. But I think that that's just my experience. But I will say this from an education standpoint: I can help a student solve exposure faster in digital because the information's there.
Yeah. James, you want to add something?
Yeah, Kai, you calling me out on Pictorico? That's how I paid for all our beers at Columbia. What are you talking about? We all know platinum prints sell more than inkjet prints or silver gelatin prints. Pictorico all day long.
But that's not true, by the way.
Oh, it's true. Fact.
Oh, really? Ask Gursky how much his platinum prints are selling.
Well, I'll just tell you from my personal experience. I'll take a photo.
That's different.
13 by 19.
My personal experience,
having silver
done,
gelatin print, sells for $100
as well. Having done platinum and albumin, I'm getting
$1,500 for the platinum all day long.
Yeah, well, maybe this is a good thing to end on.
I'm not saying I support it. I'm just saying it's fact. And that goes back to the market. We didn't really talk much about what the market thinks of this and dictates a lot of these decisions. If you're doing this professionally, I mean, you have to think about some of these things sometimes. It's disgusting, but it's the truth.
I also remember the argument that back when I was running Palladio, people were very interested in whether it was platinum or palladium in the image, because platinum was more expensive, so it would be a better print if it were all platinum. Now that palladium's 4 times the expense of platinum, maybe that argument reversed. I mean, I think it's a specious argument, but it speaks to the lack of sophistication for many photography collectors as opposed to art collectors.
Once you get into the marketplace, all logic goes out the window, right? I mean, that's if we think it
Absolutely.
has
Yeah.
any that there's any meritocracy built into any aspect of it, it's completely false. I mean, going back to that Gursky I showed as the most expensive photograph, you know, it's gets people up in arms, but whatever.
Well, Kai, we also see it in education too. I mean, look at a lot of the, you know, you were speaking towards faculty that doesn't have a darkroom practice. Yeah, they're the ones running photo departments, and they're the ones teaching the next generation. They're the ones that are, you know, spreading their knowledge, but their knowledge isn't in the darkroom. So it's that tension of the ones that us that still use the darkroom trying to defend something that we know is getting, you know, replaced with computers at campuses all over the country.
Isn't that something to do with Luddites? Hasn't this happened before?
Well, I don't think anyone, haven't heard of a single black and white or analog, quote unquote, analog photographer going in and smashing up a digital lab yet. So until that happens, I don't think we have any real Luddites out there.
Well, yeah, when Ilford goes out of business, it'll be a different argument for different reasons. But, you know, making the argument that a technology is necessary fails over time, except for a very small section of the marketplace. You know, and there are always people who will turn it into a highly arcane craft process and do great with it and do amazing shit with it. And then there are people like Sally Mann with her collodion stuff, which is all about artifice and very little about who gives a shit, as opposed to her kids.
Yeah, we will see as that's what I put those ones in about those filters that are available for all these, you know, plugins for Lightroom and everything is when does everything, you know, go down to just being a filter and therefore, you know, all of these analog artifacts are really just that. It's, you know, at that point, some things might start to collapse. But the part of it that I was still interested in and I wanted to forefront in my part of the talk was the idea that as a maker, you've got to engage with your process and the way that it is, and that you are spoiled for choice now. There's so many different ways to think about it. And so why going back to the original premise of shooting film in the digital age, question mark, question mark, question mark, you know, I think there are still very valid reasons and passionate reasons to talk about it. But I also think that it shouldn't be at the forefront of the conversation and nor on the positive or the negative. And I think that that's where it becomes problematic is when, you know, people are trying to make this kind of value judgment of like, you know, this is right, this is wrong. If you're doing this, you are too backwards thinking. If you're doing this, then you're, you know, not engaging with the medium properly, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where things start to break down. And as educators or as artists or, you know, as just people interested in photography still and engaging with it in a serious fashion, I think it's just at least smart to be aware of where the conversation's going or what people are talking about. And I also think it's exciting that people who have started off in one way or the other. If you started off in digital, you know, as a young person where that was everything and now you're taking up film, you know, I think that's great. If you start off in film like most of us and they're switching over to digital like Claudio's story or Rob's story, I think that's great too. I mean, I think there's, but it goes back to a belief system, an engagement with the medium, and hopefully just a seriousness about what you're trying to do, right? I think that's the end all kind of part of it. So we're now at an hour and a half. So I'm going to call it quits and say thank you to everyone for coming on. And of course, I'm glad we got passionate. It's interesting that Dennis, who commented on Instagram, stayed silent, but maybe he's he's fashioning a rebuttal for later, or maybe Yoav took care of everything for him. I'm not sure. But thank you all for coming. It was so great to see you. And it's so much better to have these conversations even over Zoom than to just be looking at the latest statistics and insanity about chewable Clorox. So thank you. All for coming. And I hope to see you guys next week. Thank you. Take care.